this disruption on both the supply side as well as the demand side has made very clear that whatever good globalization may have done, it has certainly made countries more vulnerable to exogenous shocks, whether those shocks come from health crisis or shocks coming from the environment. Individual countries have become, and indeed whole areas, whole regions have become much more vulnerable as a result of this globalization. The challenge, therefore, the first challenge, therefore, is how to build resilience within countries and within a particular region so that we can face future pandemics and the future environmental crisis in such a way that we don't suffer so much at the human level. The logical thing, therefore, in building this resilience is at the region to build supply chains and demand structures at the regional level rather than at the global level. The logical thing is for neighboring countries, like in South Asia, for neighboring countries to integrate their supply chains and their production systems and their demand structures in such a way that that resilience is built into their economies and also at the regional level. The second implication that comes out of it is that in the process, in integrating production structures, we need to do some new kind of regional specialization of production. For example, the production of medical supplies, whose shortage we felt acutely in each of the countries of South Asia during this crisis. We need to build a regional capability for high quality medical supplies at low prices. And now, particularly if this vaccine comes into existence, the Chinese are already testing a vaccine in Pakistan, as are the British and the Americans. They're doing it in their own countries. I don't see why South Asia can't develop a vaccine, COVID vaccine, or import it in sufficient quantities and then build a domestic supply capability for this. So cooperation in terms of building a production capacity for key medical supplies. The third, I think, dimension of these exogenous shocks is something that's already upon us, but because of the pandemic, it slightly faded into the background. But I think we need to pull it back forefront. And that is the environmental crisis. The environmental crisis hasn't gone away as a result of the pandemic. It's still there. In fact, it's worsening. And South Asia is particularly vulnerable to climate change because we're all dependent on the monsoons. And a large proportion of our populations, the majority of our population, is dependent on the rains falling during the monsoon at the right time and in the right quantities, because most of our populations are in the field of agriculture, are dependent on agriculture. So we are very vulnerable to the environmental crisis, and three kinds of vulnerabilities are apparent. The first is that there is going to be possibly a major water shortage in the region, in the major rivers, particularly in northern India and Pakistan. Water shortage, which will have its own impact on agriculture production and on industrial and social life, in fact. The second thing is that the direct heat effect of on grain seeds. Our grain seeds in South Asia are highly vulnerable to temperature changes, temperature increases. The direct heat effect has been estimated by the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC. They have estimated that there could be as much as a 30% in South Asia. Now, if God forbid that happens, we are really talking about the of a famine. And it's important to come together and develop heat-resistant varieties, put our brain power to develop more. Sorry, we got cut off for some reason. I was just mentioning the the elements of the environmental crisis and why we need to come together as a region to mitigate its impact. And the first, as I said, is to develop together heat-resistant varieties of food grain so we don't face famines in the foreseeable future. The second, of course, is to develop technologies for more water-efficient methods of agriculture production. Things like producing high value-added vegetables and other crops through the use of drip irrigation or tunnel farming. So we need these new technologies which will, on the one hand, reduce the use of water, reduce the consumption of water in the process of production, and on the other hand, produce more value added. So we get a larger value per unit of water use in the region. The third vulnerability, I think, is that as the sea levels rise following the melting of the Arctic ice, many of our low elevation coastal zones in South Asia will get salinized. Seawater will come in and then go back, but deposit a lot of salt in areas where agriculture was being practiced along the coast in South Asia. And I think Bangladesh and the coast of India and Pakistan are highly vulnerable to this problem. And therefore, what is possible is that there could be an large-scale inward shift of population. People who are dependent on agriculture for their livelihoods might begin to migrate. And when they migrate, they could migrate across districts or even countries. So large numbers of people shifting from one place to the other can cause a lot of social disruption and political tensions, and we need to build institutional structures through which we can handle this phenomenon of large-scale migration. And then finally, we are all going to face energy problems as our economies grow. And the logical thing to do is to produce hydroelectric power, which is very cheap, rather than use furnace oil, which is very expensive. And so if we need to go into hydroelectric power, what is essential is to link up our electricity grids. So we need to have an integrated electricity grid across South Asia, so that countries which with a lot of rivers with the high heads, where there's a lot of potential for electricity production, such as in Nepal or Bhutan and northern Pakistan, and indeed parts of northern India. In those areas, hydroelectric production could begin, and we could put it into a South Asian grid. And so in principle, Bhutan should be able to export electricity to Pakistan or to Bangladesh. And so, integrating electricity grids is the last sort of proposal I was going to mention. In brief, to conclude, we in South Asia, in facing the pandemic, must realize that we're also facing a major environmental crisis in the years ahead. And we need to prepare for these exogenous shocks by building more resilient economies and societies. And building more resilient economies means that we need regional economic integration. Trade and investment flows must take place, and new production structures should emerge. where there are regional supply and demand chains rather than global ones. That is the way to build resilience. That is the way to build a better future for our people. And history shows that when a community or a set of communities faces a common crisis, their chances of survival lie in cooperation rather than in conflict and tensions. And so I think our respective governments need to think very seriously about overcoming, their individual bilateral tensions and problems in the larger interests of their people, and in the joint aspiration to build a better future for the people of South Asia. I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Akmal Hussain. Thank you for providing thoughtful vision for post-COVID regional cooperation. In fact, I mean, you have set the stage for our discussions and the discussions with our panelists. Now I turn to our panelists to make the session more engaging. Well, instead of, monologue and remarks, I propose, to put few round of questions to our panelists. And the panelists, to answer in 3-4 minutes. Our logistic colleagues will alert you about the time. And I request you to honor, the allocated time. Well, here, Professor Akmal has indicated that this pandemic have exposed the weakness of existing global order. The global order defined by profit, defined by global value chain, and it has made both people and country vulnerable to the external shocks. Now, now my questions to our panel, to all of three, is what is your view on how global order would unfold in post-pandemic world? First, let me start with Mr. Gyan Acharya. Sir, you have 3 to 4 minutes. Please, now you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Poshrajji, distinguished speakers, Professor Akmal Hussain, Madame Dusni Verakon, Dr. Dave, I'm sure that you'll be joining it later, and many distinguished participants, and I'm not going to call their name, but I'm very happy to see them on the screen. I think it is a very good afternoon. I think we had a very good start in terms of really building resilience at the regional level, but that is still, we live in a real world. And if you look at the connectivity, if you look at the, the interconnections in terms of the trade, in terms of people, in terms of our economic activities, I think this is still very far off. So I think we have to really understand. But then you are asking me about the global order, how we are going to see the global order unfolding because of the COVID-19. I think it is very important when you talk about the global order. I think when we think about global order, it is about multilateral principles, that is as defined in the United Nations Charter, the multilateral institutions, whether it is a Bretton Woods, WTO regime, or the United Nations, and then you have multilateral initiatives, whether it is on disarmament, whether it is on human rights, whether it is on trade, or whether it is on economic collaboration at the global level. I think we have to really look at that. And if you see of course, it is not that it is the COVID-19 which brought all the challenges in the multilateral level. It was there before, and we have seen that unilateralism was rising, the protectionism was growing, and then of course you had the fragmentation of the response of the pandemic. If you look at the institutions, even they are, what they are talking about in terms of the challenges that we face. Yes, it is important, but they have not really been up to the plate, and that's the reality that we live in. Now, what has really happened and there is, of course, we all know, a very strong contest, whether it is a hard power or the soft power between the established ruling superpower and the rising superpower, and I would add aspiring superpower and other major powers. So all these elements have made it really difficult. The fault lines were already there, but now because of the COVID-19, I think it has given one more excuse for everyone to really sharpen those fault lines. And that is a tragedy of the world that we live in. Perhaps we will be living even we are probably witnessing the vaccine diplomacy going on around the world. So what we are really looking at the moment is the fragmentation of cooperation, the marginalization of the multilateral or the global order fundamental principles. And that is a very, very worrisome to all of us. I'm not saying that everything is bad and everything is falling apart, but we see the signs which are there, which will make the global order even more fragmented, more unprincipled, and probably even more difficult going ahead. That's why I think it is very important for all the countries, especially those who are championing for the multilateralism and who will be really losing if there is only a power, the play at the global level. I think they should come around and really re-stress the importance of the fundamental principles of the multilateralism as well as the global order that we have today. Of course, that doesn't mean that we should not reform. Definitely, the current form of the global order is neither just nor inclusive. That is very important, as you heard other speakers also talking about the unfairness of the globalization, the challenges of the cross-border implications of the climate change. Look at the pandemic, look at the poverty, look at the terrorism. All these things are really having a very big problem. So what it has really shown, the COVID-19 has probably shown also, is that no matter how powerful you are, I mean, you cannot take care of the global pandemic on your own. There is a need for global cooperation. There is a need for global standards. There is a need for even the very robust international health regulations. There is a need for stronger global cooperation. Look at the COVID-19 initiative. We used to have, especially, because I started in the UN, I know that there is always a challenge in terms of providing development cooperation part. It is always only the developed countries only meet about less than half of the actual commitment. But when it came to the humanitarian principles, normally you get about 90-95% coverage in terms of the support at the international level. But this time around, if you look at the COVID-19 and other initiatives, the expectation was about $16-17 billion, but what we have is about $4-5 billion so far, maybe $6-7 billion. So the gap is still about 2/3 of what it used to be before. So it is very clear when you look at the global level, this fragmentation, this the isolationism, if you like, or the lack of very strong, robust international order is something that is really worrisome for all of us. And that will really have an impact on all the countries around the world, but especially those countries which depend so much on the global level in terms of engagement. Look at the economic growth impact, look at the trade impact. Of course, WTO has come out, said that it was expecting 30%, 15 to 30%, but we are at the moment seeing, the global trade reduction on the lower bound. That is, but it is a very low. And look at the economic growth rate and the impact, the cascading impact it will have on ODA, probably on the remittances or even the trade demand side. So I see that I think we have to really look at, I think some of the point that Professor Akmal mentioned is also very important. How do we really build resilience at the regional level in terms of the areas in which we can cooperate? So I think those are some of the issues that we should be looking at, but we should be also stressing that we should also be stressing that, do you hear? We should be also stressing that there has to be a very strong recommitment to the reformed global order that can really look at the whole world in an inclusive manner, because we all know that if the COVID-19 is not taken care of in every country of the world, it is going to hunt back again. We have already seen that how strong this COVID-19 is, because it is already recurring in many of the countries in Europe. So I think this is the message that we see. How we can really strengthen global cooperation is equally important, and we have to lend voice, a collective voice from all the countries around the world, but particularly South Asia, which has to depend, which depends so much on the international engagement, and there are so many constraints, that we all really face. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Acharya. Well, so now I turn to Dr. Depriya Bhattacharya. Dev, I hope you are here.
Very much here, listening
Okay.
to you.
Okay.
A pleasure,
Thank
brother,
you.
to see you. I see you have a new mustache.
Yeah.
That's good.
Well, Mr. Acharya has mentioned that, I mean, the current global order,
Yeah.
I mean, it needs to be reformed, and it has to be cooperative, I mean, global order rather than competitive global order for just and inclusive, I mean, society.
No,
And he also, I mean, mentioned the risk of being fragmented, multipolar, unprincipled, and also, I mean, moving towards isolation regions, right? So my questions, I mean, again, I have the same questions to you, Dr. Dev. Well, are you optimistic or pessimistic, as you mentioned in your recent publication in OECD Development Matters, and how you see, I mean, the global order unfolding after this pandemic?
Thank you.
Dr.
Thank you,
Dev,
Posh. Let me first congratulate Swati for organizing this event. I think it's a fantastic idea, and I see a lot of my peers and also my senior colleagues. I'm so happy to see them all over here and getting the new feel of the new South Asia in certain ways. I would like to compliment Professor Akmal Hussain for his, this very thoughtful piece. He have laid out the big frame of issues. And particularly as a very committed South Asian, he has talked about the new rationale for getting together in the context of the pandemic. And Ambassador Gyan Acharya, as usual, has mentioned about the dysfunctional multilateral system and the fragmentation which is taking place. And he also talks about how the development cooperation in terms of failing the marginalized countries in certain ways. I agree with all those big issues over there. Let me be very short and in this 3-4 minutes which allocated to me. My first and foremost point is that, as you know, there's shock has created a new, I think it's a new uproar in terms of thought process. And we see that the global thinking process is very much divided into largely two groups, in the pessimists and the optimists. And I am pretty sure we have those who have gathered here today are more optimists than pessimists, because they want to make good use of a crisis to do some good. The crisis should not be wasted in terms of doing good. So that's the point. So the optimism, the pessimism part is quite natural, that you will see more authoritarian approach, you will see more closing space of the civil society, more digital surveillance of activities. You will see that the economic role of the state also becoming more obvious in the cutting. This we will see, and we will have to wait till November this year to see how the world goes after that. So I see that is one way of looking at it. But then there comes this optimism. Now, if you review all the optimism, and Professor Akmal is one of those optimists, I'm sure, one of those, the very traditional person who has held the South Asian optimism, custodian of that. And Gyan is more in the global frame, and my other colleagues are here. The point is that with the problem with the optimism is that they talk about the rational, but the first and foremost, they cannot talk about, they do not really lay down the pathway, how to get there. So we all understand we need a South Asian vaccine. We know that we have to, for environment, we'll have to get together. For there, we need to have cross-border various kinds of trade, investment, and others. But under the new circumstances, it seems to be quite distant from the reality that never before South Asia had been so far away from regional cooperation as it is today. Even the COVID may not have helped it further in that way. We are not having a SAARC summit for the last couple of years, and it is quite obvious there is no political momentum in order to bring those countries together very soon together. We did appreciate the telephone call coming from Delhi to all other countries in the region. in the wake of this virus, but it did not really take us any further. Just to give you a comparative example, the amount of local regional interaction we have seen in sub-Saharan Africa or in Latin America or in the Caribbean was totally absent in South Asia during this COVID period, as is the reality, will say. So my first point is that the colleagues will have to tell me, how do you get from point A to point B? What are the priorities, how it is being sequenced, and etc. The second problem on these issues is that we have now a new set of actors under the new circumstances. So it is true that the days of the hyper-globalization is gone, but it is not true. It is also true the rise of the state I am taking. So I do not see how these new actors are going to play a role in the future, where the state is going to be much more dominant in the coming days. I'll have to finish very fast. And the third point is that if the state becomes more dominant, the old way of thinking that market mechanism will bring back and will the private sector run the show and etc. is also very, very difficult thing to talk about now. And along with that, you have a new information technology and fourth industrial revolution unfolding, which may not have the same implication in many areas, and particularly for territorial integration as we thought is to think in the global value chain and others in the old system. So my closing point is that, colleagues, that we may all agree that this is a good thing to do, but we will have to have a blueprint for that, the pathways, the mechanism, the role of the actors. And in this case, the new world which is taking place, which is not only devoid of multilateralism, it is devoid of global rules. And as you see, even the last 48 hours, how the corporate behaviors, the financial sector, all these are coming through, how you are going to deal with it. So will that all lead into redefining the region? Will that lead into redefining the mechanism, how we used to think about development? Will that lead into in a new actors to be brought in? I think it is time to think out of the box. If you want to build, I am not very much sure that can build it based on our old-fashioned ideas of South Asian solidarity. It is a time to take ourselves out from the box and think through with new intra-regional relationship within a new global order. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Bhattacharya.
I had been everything post, but not a professor.
Okay, Dr. Bhattacharya.
That's why.
Dr. Bhattacharya. Well, so now I turn to Dr. Dushini. Dushini, I have the same questions, for you. That is, what is your view on how global order would unfold in post-pandemic world? Dr. Dushini, you have the floor.
Thank you, Posh. And let me say that it's a pleasure to see familiar faces on the screen, and in many respects also to be revisiting topics that we have endlessly discussed, even face-to-face at various seminars and conferences. I agree with the views put forward by the two previous speakers. Not all of it, but I think both really have touched on the main issue as I see it. The global order is in many ways it's sharpening pre-existing conditions that were already happening in terms of the rivalries and tensions between the US and China, and I think all countries are going to feel the impacts and implications of that, and South Asian countries are not immune to those, to being caught up in those developing tensions. Now, one of the key COVID-19 related, I think, experiences is the vacuum in global leadership. I think that Dr. Acharya referred to, and it is again an indication of the breakdown of multilateralism and the very unilateral approach that countries are taking to deal with this crisis. And you can see that in terms of the instinctive responses of countries that are increasingly looking inwards for solutions. And that, I think, has key implications for the South Asian region, which anyway, historically and traditionally has a tendency to look inwards. I think COVID-19 and the barriers that we have put up to defend and deal with the pandemic will have more sustained and long-term consequences unless we are very watchful and we are careful. A simple example, I think, is the fact that many countries put up export barriers to begin with, in terms of restricting exports of medicines, in terms of restricting imports of food. But slowly those are also now becoming import controls, whether for reasons of securing jobs and livelihoods, or whether for reasons of securing foreign exchange, etc. And I think the breakdown of multilateralism and the shift to the sort of more of a unilateral approach, all these coincide to make us put up barriers, not only at borders, but within countries to deal with this crisis. And there, I think, a very real possibility that even beyond the recovery stage, we will see that shift towards more of the populist nationalism that we are seeing in South Asia taking root. So I am on the pessimistic side when it comes to the very sort of optimistic prescriptions for South Asia to move forward on integration, on trade, on investment, etc. I really don't see that COVID-19 is opening the space for that. What I see instead is that even the current limited space that we had, in some sense, is closing up. So I also my final point for the South Asian region, I think, also is that it is not for South Asia the global rivalries and tensions that are erupting, not only between US and China, but China and India, also has implications for how the South Asian region will begin to respond and react as we move into economic recovery and a sustained sort of, hopefully, a sustained recovery process. I'm going to stop there because we're running out of time.
Thank you, Dusini. Well, now I move from general issues to specific issues. And I turn to Mr. Acharya. Mr. Acharya, Dr. Dev has indicated that in the post-COVID, global order, the state is going to be a dominant player. And when we talk about the state, its role is generally defined by the political system. So, in post-COVID situations, how do you see the political order? Do you see any risk for democratic system rather than inclusive democratic system? Please unmute.
Thank you very much. I think that is a very important question. I think we should not jump to the conclusions because we were still in a very early stage in terms of whether those who have, the state-led systems are more, successful in terms of containing it or not. If you look at the example, of course, people are certainly looking at the example of China alone, but there are other countries, despite the fact that they don't have that level of state, the control, but they still have managed to have the COVID under control. Even, countries like New Zealand, there are also other countries, even the North, the Europe. So What is important, I think it is more than the political order. It is more like the effectiveness of the state institutions. I think this is how perhaps we should be really looking at in terms of delivering services. This is what we should be looking at, not necessarily ideological, the role of the state as such. So it doesn't have to be one party state to be effective in terms of really controlling this. But what is important is that those state institutions which are there, whether it is in a democracy or in other institutions, if they are delivering, so naturally those who are delivering well are in a better position than others. But then the second question perhaps is also equally important. Naturally, in pandemics like this, you should also think about what was the initial condition of the health system as well as other service delivery in a particular country. So that debate is now definitely coming out. If you had the initial health conditions which were better than before, better than many other countries, naturally your response to the COVID and the pandemic would be also stronger. But if you had a very low level of health facilities, low investment in the health related sector, then naturally the situation becomes really very difficult. But there are also some issues, of course, in countries where freedom is really taken to the extreme, when even the pandemic is, whether you have to use the mask or not is also being debated to the extreme. And then that is a totally a different case of extreme, I should say, the use of the word of, the freedom. But we have to look at the middle, those where you have rules about pandemics, you have a rule about those crises, but then again, you have to look at the, the effectiveness of the state institutions. I think that is where we have to really look at, but definitely the issue has been, really brought to the fore. I think we should have a debate. It is not yet settled how we are going to deal with that, but it has been going on for quite a while. If I know, between the institutions and the role of the effectiveness of the institution and the delivery, and then how you can really also ensure that there is a larger participation of the entire community, being inclusive with the people, and then of course sensitizing and mobilizing the whole of the nation, or it is only the the directed state institutions that is being effective in terms of dealing with the pandemic. So I think those are the issues that we should be looking at. But again, what is equally important for us is that what it has really also shown, I think that is also the issue that came up during the discussion, that this geostrategic competition has also played a very important role in terms of now probably even having an access to the vaccine, as well as probably having the cooperation really being effective for all the countries around the world. I think in a normal situation, we would be expecting that there will be inclusive international support from all the countries around the world. But look at the, some of the, even the initiatives of the WHO, which has not received support from major two powers, both, China and America, were not coming forth in a way that they normally used to come in the past. So those things are naturally coming into play. So the superimposition of this great power competition, as well as the, the dynamics of the political ideology in these countries is also coming out into play. But I think it is too early. It is too early to really say it say it definitely whether this has really, done better for those where the state-led institutions are more, prominent, or where, the participatory, democratic and other institutions. I think we have to really look for a little bit more time to really see its end result. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Acharya. Now I turn to Dr. Bhattacharya.
Yep.
Dr. Bhattacharya, I mean, you talk about the need for thinking out of box, and also, you talk about the need for a new kind of blueprint or pathways or roadmap after this pandemic. But here, Mr. Acharya, he raised the issue of geostrategic competition. I mean, in fact, if you look at the current global order, now it is not, it's now most of the great power, they are taking the actions as in the form of zero-sum logic. The gain for one power is lost for another. And again, in preparing first questions also, Mr. Acharya, he also talked about existing superpower, aspiring superpower, and also rising superpower. So here, my questions to you is, how do you see the impact of this geostrategic competition or geopolitics in your proposed that blueprint, new blueprint or new roadmap for global order?
Yep. Thank you. Be very brief, because these are all billion-dollar questions, each of them, but let me be very brief. I agree that things have not stabilized as yet. So I do see an interim period coming up in the next calendar year and thereafter. So next 2 to 3 years and going beyond up to 5, there will be an interim period before we think through or stabilize a new set of global orders, both institutions and the rules of the games, and also the conduct. So that's said. But if you take up what Ambassador Acharya said, that effectiveness of the state. Now here, how do you really measure the effectiveness of the state? It would seem that the China coming out much more successful than definitely USA or Europe, but not necessarily than from New Zealand or Singapore or South Korea. The issue is that effectiveness is measured in terms of saving lives or health issues only, or it will also take note of other impacts, for example, growth of inequality, poverty, rise in maternal mortality, child healthcare issues, and etc., malnutrition. More importantly, also the issue of information. Are we really sure about the number of deaths and the casualties or the infection we are getting from an authoritarian state is really the right one to believe in? So I think to measure that effectiveness is not so easy in terms of, because there is a short and medium term, and there are also domain issues over there. And if you look at the global strategic competition and also geostrategic in the current level, India, China, also about the Belt and Road or the Indian Ocean Alliance, what we are seeing, and beyond that, geostrategic. Look at the bilateral issues in South Asia at this moment. At this moment, hardly any South Asian country doesn't have a bilateral issue with its neighbor. And there is no platform at this moment to discuss these issues. So you see, it is a void in certain ways. So this void compels us to recreate the new reality in certain ways. Maybe this is an opportunity to start from zero. And this will bring in the new actors in the certain ways with a new agenda. How do you develop in this geostrategy? We should remember countries like Bangladesh or Nepal or Bhutan or even Sri Lanka, they are not price setters in this world. They are price takers. Others set the price, they take it. This is a very unfortunate situation, unfortunately. And when you have a broken multilateral system, you have a dysfunctional regional platform. So you will have to think through, be more opportunistic. So I see each country will become more opportunistic, and for the immediate future. Not that I'm recommending that it may be a suboptimal strategic approach. And with this they will try to grow within the creeks and the cracks of this geopolitical strategy. They will try to play all the regional powers or the global powers simultaneously. Bangladesh is a classical case for that. And how long they can do that, sustain that, it's a different issue. But I see a much more opportunistic and episodic approach which will come up in immediate future. My appeal to the thinkers who have gathered here is that just we need to come out from the box. If we want to think that this is the old South Asia, I can put $1 bet on here. How many of us really believes that SAARC will again become functional in the next 3 to 4 years? I want to put a bet on that. Let me put a bet on that. How many of you, let us do a survey immediately, that you think in the next 2 years, SAARC will be a functional platform or not? If not, then how do we really rebuild our regional, sub-regional platform? Maybe South Asia is gone. Southern Asia is maybe in town. South Asia, so may have to redefine even the regional entity under the new circumstances. And you will have to allow the varying geometry, what we say in the WTO parlance, to realign with issue-specific realignment as will come. There is no grand alliance we may not see in the immediate future. So I see the immediate future is more complicated. It will demand more sophisticated handling. And I think it will demand a much more innovative thinking, particularly this for small states like us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya, for out-of-box questions. Now I turn to Dr. Dushini. Dr. Dushini, I mean, in your previous interventions, you mentioned the disruption of global value chain. You also talked about deglobalizations, and also new protectionism, export ban of medicine and medical products. And similarly, Professor Akmal Hussain, he also talked about ineffectiveness of existing financial institutions. So here, my questions to you is, how do you see future economic order, post-pandemic economic order? Dr. Dushini, you have the floor.
To me, that is in some sense related to the previous question also, in the responsiveness and effectiveness of states in dealing with the pandemic. And I take a different view here from Dr. Acharya's comment that we have to still wait and see. Yes, I think we will have to wait and see the final analysis, but as of now, I think the general accepted view is that certain countries and regions have managed to handle the pandemic much more effectively. There has been strong leadership, strong institutions that have backed up that process. And if you look at the geography of that, then you would say that East Asian countries and the East Asian region has done much better than Europe and of course the US, which is struggling. That, to me, I think gives credence to the idea that China is going to emerge out of this in a far better shape than countries that are struggling, and will have an edge. Whether that edge is going to be sustained and going forward next 3, 4, 5 years or into next decade, I don't know. But I think there is the COVID-19 in a sense, again, it is providing validation to the idea that economic power was shifting to the Asian region, and the losers of that process are the Western economies. Two reasons. I see that in terms of the state-led model, I think countries that are not even generally used to seeing the state being involved have witnessed it in very significant ways during this pandemic. The state has not only been involved in providing health services, but they have been drafted in to provide food. They have been drafted in to ensure that there is trace and quarantine. The armed forces in most countries have been involved in quarantine procedures. So I think most countries, whether they are in a much more authoritarian model or a much more liberal democracies, have seen the ways in which the state operates changing during these last few months. And I feel that in some sense, the East Asian example of a different model of state-led development has come out on top in terms of some credible evidence of leadership and of stronger institutions. And that will also give them a leg up in terms of getting ahead on the economic recovery as other countries are still struggling. So to me, in terms of the rivalries and the competing interests and the global tensions between the US and China, I see China coming out on top. You can already see that their economy is recovering, and whether they will be able to sustain that is still not clear. But to me, the balance of economic power shift that was already tilting towards Asia is going to get a leg up as a result of the COVID-19. I'm done.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dushili. So now I turn to the third round of questions, and it's basically related to South Asia region. Well, so first, maybe this is for all of you. This question is for all of you. My first concern is, well, maybe for good or bad, this global order is going to change. So the question is how South Asian countries are going to manage the challenges produced by new global order. That is one issue. And another, how are we going to adapt or reimagine ourselves and our institutions? Here, Dr. Dave, he talked about SARC and failure of SARC, and also possibility of new institutions. So what kind of institutions we can develop to adapt and to address those challenges? And maybe if you can highlight some of the areas or some sort of provide element of roadmap, then it would be it would be good. But again, taking into limited times, I'm not sure how much can we address. Now first I turn to Mr. Ambassador Acharya. Sir, now you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very important question, but maybe we have to look at, of course, South Asia is more than SARC as well. That is also valid. Of course, SARC is only one of the many interactions that we have within South Asia. A very important one as a regional organization, but we also realize that we live in a real world. We are least integrated. We all know that. And look at the connectivity, as I was just saying in the beginning as well. I think what is also important, I think going back to what Dave was also saying, was that, there is a variable geometry that he was talking about, and I would like to also talk about that, floating coalition. That is what is also a terminology which is being used now on various issues. It doesn't have to be, and it is never mutually exclusive. You can have South Asia, you can have we are having BIMSTEC, we have a relationship with China, your relationship with the international community. So you take all the relationship in all different dimensions together. And to the extent that it works, of course, that you push and then you try to work on that, because there is a lot that you can gain. For example, there is a lot of study that has been, and we all know that, that if we were to have a better integrated, the South Asia, how much benefit each of country would get. Even a country like Nepal would get 2/3 more trade and the economic benefit. All these countries, then Sri Lanka, then Bhutan, and all the Pakistan and all of that. So we know that, but still it is. We know the reality that we live in. We have been trying very hard. I'm not saying I don't believe that we should look at the alternative, but we should say that we should even work harder to promote this regional integration, especially in the core area in which we can have at least basic understanding. I mean, there was a talk about, of course, Akmal Hussain, Professor Akmal Hussain was talking about energy grid. There is also a connectivity issue. It doesn't have to connect all of that together, at the same time, but you can have the connectivity being slowly built up and then have a better, perhaps the regional production, the value chain, which is what is not happening. If you look at the South Asia, it is least integrated in terms of the, the production network as well as the value chain. There is a lot. And in fact, because of the competition that is going on, and perhaps even a decoupling, people are talking about in terms of production, trade, and technology, you can look at how you can also position yourself, South Asia, in that overall new, forthcoming global economic order. And the second question that you were asking, of course, that there is a superimposition of the global context in South Asia as well. Each country has to find the cooperation, right modality of collaboration with all the powers. If you look at the South Asia, then again, country like Nepal, we look at China, you look at South Asia, you look at, the Western countries, you look at the major Asian powers. So all the countries that we are, talking about in South Asia, given their aspirations, given their, the degree of interaction with the outside world, they have to find a proper balance between really taking all their relationship together. And it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. We can find a way, but I'm sure that all countries look at them from a perspective of both the short-term and the long-term interest, and also in a way that, we should not be put in a position whereby we should have an awkward choice of either or. And we should be really working for and. That is very important. If you are having collaboration with India and China and United States or probably Europe, because the nature of relationship that we have today really demands that you should have, and every country would like to have that type of, the freedom of choice, freedom of options, which is very important. And this is the nature of the world that we live in. That's why I would suggest that this is one of the area where we can really make progress, especially in the connectivity, energy, probably some of the production network, the value chain. Perhaps South Asia can really focus more specifically, but at the same time, we can work with the international community and find a proper balance in terms of, going forward in the new, the contested global as well as a regional.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Acharya. Now I turn to Dr. Dev.
Yes, Posh.
Yes, yeah, you have the same questions, Dr. Dev.
Yeah. No, I am more confused than many others over here. So I do not have that much of clarity of thought. That is the point I am trying to make, that we are still going through a process. It will, the storm is yet to stop. So we are yet to count what is the casualty and how many have survived. So we have an interim period. I believe that we have an interim period coming up. And as I said, immediate interim is up to November 2020 till the great election takes place. So that is one way of is to look at that on that. But let me be very. I see the questions which are coming up in the chat box, and let me try to respond to one or two of them.
Yeah, there is one question directly to you.
Yeah, I am reading with great interest the chat box questions, all of them. Yeah. And thank you for all those comments, colleagues who are there. My first and foremost point is that I see this interim period, and within this interim period, I see that we will be operating between two extremes. On the one extremes, the weak, smaller developing countries in the south of the south, they will be fighting for restoration of multilateralism, no doubt about that, because the rule of law for the weaker countries are better protected within the multilateral system, with more reinstitution of WHO, WTO, and many others, and also those who are dealing with corporate governance and seeing that the corporate business practices are not there. All the Barclays and others, what they have done in that recent period really keeps us worried. So I think all of us, our interest in resurrection of the multilateral system, no doubt about that. Having said that, the other extreme is that I think it is time to go back to the blackboard for each of us, and from our country perspective, rebuild the agenda. Rebuild our agenda, how we relate ourselves both to those global agenda, and how do you achieve them through the regional approaches, if at all. So I will say that we operate on two ends. rebuilding from bottom-up approach, and also looking at the global issues which are there. My second point is that doing that, we may look into some of the locked-in issues. Locked-in issues means that those issues you cannot resolve without being regionally collaborative. Climate change is definitely one, which has been mentioned by Professor Akmal, and many others will agree with that. Climate change is one. I think the second issue is cross-border terrorism. For me, the second issue should be that along with the climate issues is the cross-border terrorism. So we can find out 2 or 3 of these issues which are where the state also feels comfortable and their interest is over there to rebuild on that. My third point on the think tanks, there had been a role, what the roles the think tanks should be playing. I think this is the time think tanks, while looking into the national agenda, should not become nationalist. If they also become populist, like the rest of the political elements, then there is a double danger. So I think the think tanks is that this is the time to play the balancing role in terms of keeping the space for open thinking, keeping the open, the space for thinking open, protecting that space, and also at the same time, looking into the interest of the left behind. An effective state does not necessarily mean that is equally effective for everybody. It may be effective for the powerful groups, but we have seen that even within these, the so-called effective states, the left behind peoples are suffered. Their inequality has grown tremendously. Even the biggest country, which has been mentioned by Dushni, may come out as the winner. They look at their inequality rate, how it was increased. So it is the measurement issue also. How do we look at those? Where do you see the success winning taking place? I think this is where the think tank should be more, I think, thinking through how to, in a more innovative way, look at these issues. So to building that new agenda out of the box, being supportive of multilateralism, and at the same time, looking at the granular agenda for the respective country, where we will seek opportunistic interaction with a regional framework, however you define it. And that is how it is. And that regional framework can be both 2-country, that can be 3-country, sub-regional in that way, and there can be extra-regional partners in that way. So I think nothing is excluded in this case as we think through in the future. Those were my 3 points basically. Multilateralism with a disaggregated approach. The second, to look in the locked-in agendas as climate or the cross-border terrorism. And the third, the role of the think tanks will be very paramount in order keeping up the interest of the left behind people in this particular game. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya. Well, I mean, so now I just want to open the floor, and I think we have already got many comments and questions in our chat box. And before I open floor for questions and discussions, now we have privilege to have Professor Raymond Soban over here. May I request you, sir, for a very short remark on post-pandemic global order. Professor Soban?
Thank you. I have
maybe
can you
maybe if possible, yeah. If possible, maybe in 3-4 minutes, not more than that. Very short.
Well, basically, to begin with, I would like to compliment you on at least reminding us that South Asian civil society is still alive. I've just been writing the chapter in my 3rd volume of memoirs covering South Asian issues, and was about to lament that along with the concept of South Asia, its civil society has also apparently gone into a state of hibernation. So I'm at least happy to see that Swati has restored some life to what people like myself had invested some 40 years of our life in trying to, in fact, build up a civil society within South Asia. I think the big problem which is now emerging in the middle of a COVID crisis is the complete failure within South Asia to even reflect on the collective nature of the shared problems we are facing. I mean, the reductio ad absurdum of that situation, when everyone is facing shortages, is that when we were facing an onion crisis in Bangladesh, India suddenly suspended all exports of onions coming into Bangladesh, so that whole truckloads of onions were rotting at the border until it was recently opened. Now, obviously, a minimum level of interaction within this particular period would be the need to respond immediately to the short-term specific needs imposed by the COVID crisis on particular countries, and to then look for the intermediate problem of how to deal with this. Because COVID is unfortunately no respecter of boundaries. It is a free trade commodity, which is in fact moving across all boundaries. And if in fact the largest country, India, is now emerging as the epicenter of the global crisis on COVID, then it is absolutely imperative that they interact very carefully with their neighbors to address how this process first can be contained from in fact having cross-border implications. And secondly, how we can then see collective responses to in fact deal with it. I think Mr. Modi began on the right foot, but then he forgot to move on to the left foot so that we could in fact address the problems with both feet on the ground. And I think this again is a real problem that we need to take into account. Now, the last point I would wish to make over here is that depending on how South Asian countries recognize that there are a whole range of problems, including pandemics plus the environment, for which they can only be shared in collective solutions. In the absence of doing so, then the other realities which were raised by Dushni and which were then articulated by Devapriyo are in fact going to come to the surface. There's a new balance of power is emerging in the world. We will of course see how far the November elections will make a difference, because if the leading power in the world wishes to retire into the 17th century and conduct itself on those principles, obviously the concept of globalized solutions is not going to be very serviceable, and we are going to need to take refuge within our region. And here, everything is really going to depend on which countries emerge fastest and strongest out of the COVID crisis, who can most rapidly rebuild their supply chains, and who can then open up their markets in a much more aggressive way and use their capital resources to be moved across boundaries to address all the investment needs which have been created by the vacuum and the COVID crisis. And here, of course, you can see which country is going to come out on top, to the extent that they also emerge as one of the leaders in supplying global vaccines, and in fact can then take a much more enlightened approach to it than again their competing world power, which is retreating into its nationalism and subnationalism, and in fact commit itself to meet a major part of Asia's needs, and they have the physical capacity to do that and the collaborative capacity with other multinationals. Then it is very clear as to how the world order is going to be rebalanced and how South Asia repositions itself within the emergence of that new order. So these are some of the thoughts I leave you with, but I would address it to civil society, because if political society seems to have, for its own reasons, gone into a state of self-imposed hibernation, it does not mean that civil society should become a default player in this game, because the whole concept of a South Asian civil society was to come in and fill up the spaces created by the gaps and emerging bankruptcy at the political level, and to come forward with ideas and to re-establish the concept of a South Asian community and to keep it alive. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shovan. Well, now the floor is open for questions. Well, Pushpa and other logistic colleagues, how you are going to manage this session? Question answer.
Well, thank you, sir. I think the questions are there in the chat box. Dr. Bhattacharya already started responding to them during his intervention. So if it is easier for the speakers to have a look at the questions, which has been directed to them, and then take them one by one, that might make it easier, but we can also assist in some ways. Perhaps Ambassador Acharya would want to take a few of those
Pushpa,
questions.
My question is, Pushpa, are we going to allow, putting questions directly to the panel, panelists?
Posh, if you allow me 10 seconds, I think
sure.
In the chat, the participants may raise their hands and you may allow them to speak, because we have many distinguished colleagues over here who may not have questions, but they may have good thoughts. So they can also give their thoughts, I think, whatever time is available to you. So if somebody raises the hand and Pushpa can put the name, then you can call them one by one.
Indeed, Dr. Bhattacharya, I wanted to raise that as well. Yes, we have the option of raising hands, so we open that to the participants now.
Because we have talked enough. I think let us hear the colleagues.
Ambassador Acharya, maybe meanwhile you want to take those questions?
Okay, I just wanted to take up a couple of questions that was directly directed towards me. There was one about the civil society. I think I must stress here the very important role the civil society has to play. When you look at the overall, the impact of COVID-19, and of course, it is the weaker, of course, the most vulnerable, which are being affected the most. And if you look at some of the statistics that are coming out from every country around the world, it is those who are at the bottom of the development ladder which are being affected by most. And even in a country like Nepal and many other countries, the daily wage earners and those who are having a pop and mom shops and those who really work, at the informal sector, they are the ones which are being affected the most. Therefore, the civil society has a very important role to play to sensitize the issue really to the government as well as those who are working in the field. I think that is a very important role looking at the COVID-19. And therefore, looking at the larger picture as well, in terms of making the regional as well as the global order more effective, more fair, and more just. I think having this type of the analysis coming from the ground, especially in terms of the outcome, development outcome, not necessarily the policies as well as the allocation of resources, but the development outcome from the ground, I think that is something in which the civil society has been playing a very important, but I think they can still play a very important role. I remember many of the, the initiatives that is coming out of the civil society has now taken up by the national level, at the regional level, as well as the global level. So they have made a very strong contribution. Second point, globalization. Again, I think that is very much related to it. I was not saying that globalization is, bad, especially coming from Asia, which is the, the continent which took the most benefit, if you like, of the globalization itself. That's why I think what we are saying is that, of course, the benefits had not been equal or equitable to all. That's the point. I think the globalization is there to stay, whether one likes it or not, because of the revolutions in technology, science, quantum, the physics, as well as AI, robotics, and the, the digital revolution. So it will be there. But then how do you really make it inclusive? How do you really make it, the sustainable? How do you really take care of the global, common global bads? I think that these are the issues in which I think we have to really work hard and have an order, global order, as well as a regional and the national order that will take care of the negative sides of globalization. And then finally, there was also a question about, the global order. I think this is also very important for us. There is a contest naturally between the Westphalian, the system of the primacy of a state and the global principles as propounded by the UN and other multilateral institutions. We don't want to a situation whereby the strong do whatever they can and the weak have to suffer what they must. And that's what we want to really avoid. That's why I think a very inclusive, fair, and participatory, cooperative, global order, which really takes the issues forward in a consensus with established rules and norms, and which is reflective of the current realities of the world and the equity of the world. I think that's what we are really looking for. And this is where I think the role of the think tanks, institutions would be really very, very important. And I'm very glad that this has come out all the time. But I think the very dispassionate and dynamic analysis and the out-of-box solution can only come from the think tanks and the research, because I have worked in the government. I've also worked now outside as well. I know, what the straight jacket that you are in when you are in the government, because you are very busy with so many routine things. That's why looking out of the box, looking beyond the present, looking for the long-term solution, this is the area, and the in-depth analysis. This is the area perhaps the academic institutions and the forum like this can really help the international community move towards more equitable, fair, and then of course the board, not only international, but regional as well as the national order. Thank you very much.
Okay. Puspa? Puspa?
Yes, sir. I am here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't see participants raising hands as such, but there are a few questions which have already been posed on the
By the way, Puspaji, I think there is a hand I see from the Stephen Biggs. He's raising his hand.
Okay, maybe I missed that one.
Okay.
Posh, I will take a minute later on, before closing. Okay.
Oh, sure.
So perhaps we invite Mr. Biggs for his first question.
Thank you very much for all of your contributions. I found it most interesting. I was wondering whether you feel there's going to be a renewed interest in equitable development in rural areas and in different patterns and processes of rural development, which would result in different patterns of rural industrialization. These were interests of the 1960s and 70s, which have got dropped. And it seems the present endemic has reinforced a notion that each country has to, in a sense, look in of itself, because it's having to cope on its own with the pandemic. So that's reinforced the notion of national planning. And it seems many of the issues about migration, what to do, how to go forward with a new climate change agenda, or all point towards processes of respecting more economic planning relevant to rural areas. So my question is, do any of the panel see a revision of interests in broader concepts of economic development in rural areas?
Yeah. Push, can I pick up this one?
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
Please.
Thank you. I think that's a good question. And this is precisely, I would like to address and show how the old issues will not resonate fully under the post-COVID situation. So, this rural-oriented, equitable development approach is a time-tested one. I'm not contesting the fundamental premise of that, but it has become more sophisticated and multi-granular in the recent past, particularly in the context of COVID. COVID has hit all the countries more in the urban areas than in the rural areas. So as a result, we have seen that the issue of urban poverty, the issue of the urban poor, the issue of the urban informal sector entrepreneurs have become much more critical over there. So, well, the rural area importance is there, but still we see the new faces of left behind people. We have seen now the returning migrants coming in after the post-COVID situation. So post-COVID situation will have to deal with these returning migrants, their livelihood conditions and job opportunities and etc. And in this period, what we have seen that even the lower middle class, in the absence of any social protection in these countries, have become all of a sudden very vulnerable. We are talking about the new poor now, not the traditional poor, not with pre-existing vulnerabilities exacerbated due to the crisis, but of the new vulnerabilities created with the lower middle class approach in that way. I would say that within each contextual situation, we'll have to rebuild where we need to focus it. Rural areas, if they Earlier, it was the real bastion of all the poor people. It is no more like that now in the new circumstances. So we'll have to be a bit more discerning in this particular approach as it goes. And my second point to Posh regarding this discussion which you have initiated, I think I see a question coming from colleagues Rajan Ratnan and others that if it is out of box, what it should be, what is the way out? If South Asia is not there, which Asia we should be talking about? My general point appeal is that I don't have all the answers. I can only give a good question, if at all. So my appeal to Posh is that since you are running this webinar, this is an opportunity for you also to build some idea about those agenda, the issues. What are the entry points for civil society to rejuvenate the new South Asian reality and the new South Asian solidarity and the new South Asian compact? I think this will also, in the coming webinars, you will have a unique opportunity to look into those issues. I believe that we will have to go back to our drawing boards in each of our country and look at how we need regional cooperation in order to maximize our own national approaches. And then we see the common spaces, intersecting spaces in the coming years. We are in a transition. I think it is, that's why I look at it all in a very tentative way in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Dr. Pandey, if I may again, I think, we are running out of time, but perhaps I wanted to pose this question that has been put here for Professor Akmal Hussain. There is a question about the hydropower cooperation. So Ganesh Keshi says that sharing of hydropower has been agenda for a very, very long time. But when it goes to the level of the politicians, it just dies out. So the question to Professor Hussain is if there is any suggestion that he can provide to the politicians in terms of taking this agenda of hydropower sharing forward. Professor Hussain, if you are there, I think this question is for you.
Professor Hussain?
He might have left. He's not responding.
Okay.
Yeah.
6:30.
So it's 6:30.
Oh, so okay. Now it's already 6:35, our local time. So
I think we have to wrap up.
Wrap up. Okay. Okay. Well, so, I mean, we have very rich discussion on post-COVID global order. I would like to thank our keynote speaker, our panelists, and our participants. Who put up very pertinent questions. Well, let me enumerate some takeaways. For me, out of this discussion, one takeaway, first takeaway is the world will never be same after coronavirus, after COVID. But we do not know how it is going to be. That's the number one takeaway for me. And number two, it is unlikely that there will be transformative change in political system or political order. However, we can expect some marginal change in political order. And the third is the COVID will not dramatically change the distribution of power among existing superpowers, aspiring superpowers, or rising superpowers. Nonetheless, we may have a clear picture after November US election. And the fourth takeaway is the pandemic has revealed deep-seated weaknesses of international organizations, from WTO to WHO and others, and also G7. Some of them are out of date or ill-fitted for new global challenges. It demands for the reform of these institutions. And the final takeaway is the regional cooperation would help South Asian countries to build resilience against external shock. It could be through formation of regional supply chain, or cooperation in environment, cooperation in water, cooperation in energy. And this regional cooperation would reduce the risk and vulnerabilities and would help to build back better, which is resilient. Resilient. I think I stop over here, and with this note, I thank you all for your participation. Thank you and good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Posh. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues.
It was an excellent session. You were a great moderator. That was excellent.
Oof.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's Nisha, I see that.
Yes.
Yeah.
It went well.
It was very, very enjoyable.
Thank you.
And we would also
Thank
welcome
you.
you again for the second webinar
Which
series
is
coming
second,
Friday.
that's on Friday.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.